The Game That Plays You. Part 1. Jake had always been drawn to the dark web's hidden corners, a digital playground where the bold could uncover the strange and forbidden. Late one night, sprawled across his couch with his laptop, he stumbled across a thread on a cryptic forum, a download link for a game called Pixel Pulse. No screenshots, just a vague promise of a new experience. Curiosity won out, and he clicked it, expecting some glitchy retro knockoff. The file downloaded a small exe with no icon, and he launched it. The screen flickered to life. A pixelated figure stood in a black void, its head tilted, and text blinked below. Jake. His name, stark against the darkness. He froze, his pulse quickening, but shrugged it off as a clever trick, closing the game. The room felt colder though, the silence prickling his neck. Sleep came slow, his laptop dark on the coffee table. He dreamed of a pixelated world, blocky shapes shifting, a figure moving toward him, whispering, "Jake." He jolted awake, the clock reading 3:33 a.m., his breath fogging in the chill. The laptop glowed faintly, the game open though he hadn't touched it, the figure standing still, text typing, "You're in the game." A hum buzzed from the speakers, low and rhythmic, like static with a heartbeat, and the whisper came, "Not a dream, but real, soft and chilling. Jake, you're playing." He slammed it shut, the glow dying, but the hum lingered in his ears, the whisper echoing in the dark. The next day, he couldn't shake it. The laptop worked fine, videos, chats, no trace of the game's weirdness, but the whisper stuck, a hum that followed him through the apartment, through the streets. He launched it again, the figure stood closer, text typing, "Jake, you're in the game." He hit quit, but the screen flickered, the game reopening on its own. The hum pulls sharper, shadows shifting in the corners of his vision, tall, blocky, swaying faintly. He deleted the file, but it redownloaded instantly, the hum vibrating through the room, the whisper growing, "Jake, you're playing." Curiosity turned to dread. He dove back into the dark web, hands trembling, searching for answers. A buried thread mentioned Pixel Pulse, a game tied to a gamer named Riley Voss, who'd vanished after posting, "It's not a game, it's me." The last line chilled him. "Don't play, it plays you back." He shut the laptop, but the hum buzzed from the closed lid, the whisper threading through, "Jake, you're in the game." He unplugged it, yanked the battery, but the screen glowed faintly through the night, the game alive, the figure moving closer. "Jake, you're playing." That evening, the whisper turned to words, soft, insistent, weaving through the hum, "Jake, I'm closer." He stayed in the bedroom, lights blazing, but the sound followed, seeping from the walls, the ceiling, his phone. Sleep came unbidden, and he stood in the pixelated void, the figure nearer, text typing, "Jake, you're in the game." Shadows shifting behind the screen, their heads tilted, watching. The whisper swelled, "Jake, you're playing." He woke gasping, the clock stuck at 3:33 a.m., the laptop on his bed, he hadn't moved it, the game glowing, shadows swaying in the corners, their forms tall and pixelated. The apartment felt smaller, the air thicker, as if the game watched from every angle. He tried uninstalling it, wiped the drive, smashed the keyboard, but the game returned, the figure typing, "Jake, I'm closer." The hum pulsed louder, the shadows bolder, standing in doorways, tilting their heads, shifting with the pixels. The whisper chanted, "Jake, you're playing." He turned away, but the phone screen flickered, the game loaded there too, the figure moving, shadows shifting behind it. Riley's warning burned in his mind, "It plays you back." Sleep eluded him, the hum a roar, the whisper a demand, "Jake, I'm watching." He dreamed or didn't of the figure stepping closer, "Jake, you're in the game." Shadows stretching from the screen, their forms tall and blocky, their heads tilted as if they knew him. He woke to the glow, the clock frozen, the game nearer, the figure typing endlessly, shadows standing still, their presence a cold that sank into his skin. The apartment trembled, the hum a low storm, the whisper insistent, "Jake, I'm closer." He didn't want to, didn't dare, but his hands moved anyway, drawn to the screen, the game alive, the shadows waiting still, silent, watching. The night stretched on, the game's glow bending the light, twisting it into a shimmer that pulsed with the hum. The shadows stood out tall, pixelated, faceless, watching from the walls, the windows, the dark. The whisper wove through it, "Jake, you're playing." He tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed, the hum spiking, the shadows tilting closer, their presence, a weight that crushed his lungs. The apartment wasn't his anymore, it belonged to the game, to the pixels that moved themselves too. The thing that whispered, and he was its captive, trapped by a screen he couldn't close, a hum he couldn't silence. Part 2. Jake's apartment had become a cage under the game's relentless grip, its pixelated glow a gateway to a terror that gnawed at his every breath. The hum wasn't just a sound anymore, it was a presence, a low drone that pulls through the walls, the floor, his skull, a vibration that sank into his bones, his chest, his soul, tugging at him with every flicker. The clock hadn't moved past 3:33 a.m. since he'd last dared to check, its digits flickering like a fading pulse, a cruel mockery of time that no longer held. The laptop glowed brighter, its screen a cold void of pixels, the figure closer now, text typing itself. Jake, you're playing, casting a shimmer that twisted the room into something alive, something whispering. The whisper wove through it, threading his name into the silence. Jake, I'm closer. Sleep was a distant memory, replaced by a haze where the hum ruled. He'd tried to kill the game, deleted the file, smashed the laptop with a bat, but the pieces glowed. The pixels were loading on every screen he touched. The figure typing, Jake, I'm here. The shadows stood closer now, tall, blocky, faceless, swaying with the game's rhythm, their forms sharper in the dim light, their heads tilting as if they saw him. They didn't move, didn't speak, but their presence was. A weight, a cold that pressed against his lungs, whispering his name beneath the drone. Jake, you're in the game. The whisper turned to words, soft, relentless, pulsing with the hum. Jake, I'm watching. He stayed in the living room, lights blazing, door shut, but the sound followed, seeping from the ceiling, the walls, his own breath. Sleep came unbidden, dragging him under, and he stood in the pixelated void, the figure nearer, text typing, Jake, you're playing. Shadows shifting behind the screen, their heads tilted, their forms brushing the edges of his vision. The whisper swelled, Jake, I'm closer. He woke gasping, the clock still at 3:33 a.m., the laptop beside him, he hadn't touched it, the game glowing, shadows standing in the corners, their forms swaying with the pixels. Their gaze a shiver that sank into his marrow. The apartment trembled, the hum a roar that shook his core, the whisper a chant. Jake, you're in the game. He tried to flee, grabbed his keys, yanked the door, but it wouldn't budge, the knob buzzing faintly, cold under his touch. The windows reflected not the night, but the game. Jake, I'm watching. Pixels moving, shadows shifting behind the glass, their heads tilting, watching with eyeless faces. He covered the screens, unplugged the power, but the glow followed on. The TV, in the glass of a bottle, every shine showing the game, shadows swaying in sync. Riley's warning burned in his mind. It plays you back. The shadows grew bolder that night, standing not just in corners but beside him, tall, pixelated, faceless, shifting with the text, Jake, I'm closer. Their forms his height, their heads tilting as if they knew him. The whisper roared, Jake, you're playing. He stumbled back, crashing into the couch, but the room pulsed, the glow bending the light, twisting it into a shimmer that synced with the hum. The shadows tilted closer, their forms human yet wrong, too tall, too blocky, too empty, their presence a cold that burned without heat. The apartment darkened, not from night but from the game's glow devouring it, a void that pressed against his chest, his mind, his soul. Sleep swallowed him, or didn't he? Stood in the game's world, the screen typing, Jake, I'm here. Shadows before him, their heads tilted, their forms flickering like static, their hands reaching, cold, electric, alive, their heads twitching as if they saw him. He woke to the hum, the clock frozen, the shadows closer, their forms swaying beside his bed, their cold sinking into his marrow. The glow seared brighter, reflecting not the room, but them, standing where he stood, shifting where he breathed, whispering where he was silent. Jake, I'm closer. The apartment was alive with it, the hum pulsed in the pipes, the walls, the air a drone that wouldn't rest. He tried to scream, but his voice hummed instead, a note in their rhythm, a whisper in their chorus. Jake, you're playing. The shadows stood out tall, blocky, faceless, watching from every corner, every glint, every shadow. The laptop glowed, its light a storm that tore through his core. Jake, I'm watching. Pixels moving faster, shadows shifting closer, their forms sharper, their whisper threading through his skull. Jake, I'm here. The night stretched on, the game's glow a roar that drowned his thoughts. The shadows inches from him beside him, there forms a mass that pulls with the hum, their whisper a noose tightening with every breath. Jake, I'm closer. He sank to the floor, hands trembling, the glow searing his vision. The room alive with shadows, dozens now, swaying from the walls, the ceiling, the dark. The hum was his heartbeat, the whisper his pulse, the shadows his mirror. He didn't know where he ended and they began. The apartment stilled, the glow a low pulse, the shadows standing over him, their forms a glitch in the dark, their whisper, a promise. Jake, you're in the game. The room darkened, the hum a thread in the silence, the shadows closer, their forms hovering cold, relentless, alive. He didn't remember sleeping, didn't remember waking, but the glow knew threading his name through the drone, pulling him deeper. The shadows stood within him, their forms a flicker in his vision, their whisper a chant he couldn't silence. Jake, I'm watching. The game pulsed one final time. Jake, I'm closer. The pixels speeding up, the shadows watching, waiting, claiming a gaze he couldn't escape, a hum he couldn't stop. He tried to fight, to smash the laptop again, but it glowed through the cracks. Jake, you're playing. The hum spiking, the shadows sharper, their forms swaying in time, their whisper threading through his skull. Jake, I'm here. The apartment wasn't his anymore, it belonged to the game, to the pixels that moved themselves, to the thing that whispered, and he was its captive, trapped in a screen he couldn't close, a drone he couldn't silence. Part 3. Jake's reality had crumbled beneath the game's unyielding grip, its pixelated glow avoided that, devoured his every shred of self. The hum wasn't just a sound, it was him, a relentless drone that pulls through his veins, his bones, his soul, a vibration so deep it erased all traces of who he'd been. The clock flickered at 3:33 a.m., its digits trembling like a heartbeat. On the edge, a cruel anchor in a world that no longer existed. The laptop glowed brighter, its screen a cold abyss of pixels, the figure inches away now, text typing itself without end. Jake, I'm closer, casting a shimmer that twisted the apartment into a prison alive with intent, its whisper threading his name through the dark. Jake, I'm watching. Sleep was a lost dream. The boundary between waking and nightmare had shattered under the game's haunting pulse. He hadn't slept, or had he? But the hum didn't care, dragging him under with its rhythm, its drone a chain that bound his every breath. The shadows weren't just shadows, they were the room, the glow, the air, tall, blocky, faceless, swaying with the pixels, their forms stark against the walls, their heads tilting to far, to slow. They didn't move, didn't speak, but their presence was a cold abyss, a static weight that crushed his chest, chanting his name beneath the hum. Jake, you're playing. The whisper grew sharper, its words a blade that sliced through his will, his sanity, his self. Jake, I'm here. He'd tried to fight, smash the laptop with a chair, burn the pieces, but the ashes glowed, the pixels typing on Jake, I'm watching, reinstalling themselves on every shard he touched. The shadows stood within reach now beside him, behind him, their forms human yet grotesquely wrong, their heads tilting to fast, their silence a scream beneath the drone. He clawed at the floor, desperate for escape, but it pulls back soft, alive, humming his name. Jake, I see you. The apartment trembled, the hum a storm that shook the void, the whisper of vow. Jake, I'm closer. The glow bent the light, twisting it into a shimmer that pulsed with the rhythm, casting the shadows in stark relief, dozens now, shifting from every corner, their forms brushing the walls, their presence endless. He stumbled to the window, pounding the glass, but it reflected the game. Jake, you're in the game. Pixels moving, shadows shifting behind it, their heads tilting, watching with eyeless faces. The whisper swelled. Jake, I'm watching. Sleep crashed over him, or didn't he? Stood in the pixelated void. Jake, I'm here. The figure before him, its head tilted, its form flickering like static, its hands reaching cold, electric, alive, their heads twitching as if they knew him. He woke, gasping, or didn't? The clock frozen, the shadows closer, their forms swaying beside him, their cold sinking into his marrow. The glow burned brighter, reflecting not him but them, standing where he stood, shifting, where he breathed, whispering, where he was silent. Jake, I'm closer. The apartment was alive with it, the hum pulsed in the pipes, the walls, the air, a drone that wouldn't rest, wouldn't fade, wouldn't let go. He tried to scream, but his voice hummed instead, a note in their rhythm, a whisper in their chorus. Jake, you're playing. The shadows stood out tall, blocky, faceless, watching from every surface, every glint, every shadow. The laptop glowed, its light a storm that tore through his core. Jake, I see you. Pixels moving faster, shadows shifting closer, their forms sharper, their whisper threading through his skull. Jake, I'm watching. The glow turned unbearable, casting a light that didn't illuminate but consumed, its hum a scream that drowned his thoughts. The shadows were within him, beside him, around him, their forms stark, their heads tilting, their presence a cold that devoured his nerves. The room trembled, the whisper a tempest. Jake, I'm here. He saw them, not shadows but lives endless. Loops of despair, Riley Voss swaying in the pixels, a woman whispering into nothing, figures shifting in a void that wasn't there. Each one whispered his name, a plea, a claim, pulling him into their abyss. The apartment plunged into a darkness that wasn't absence but presence, a void that pulsed with the hum, its edges brushing his skin, its weight crushing his spirit. He tried to run, but his legs were there, swaying to the rhythm, rooted by a pulse that wasn't his. The glow seared into his eyes, and he saw not himself but them, his form flickering, breaking, dissolving into the screen. Jake, I'm closer. His breath theirs, his voice theirs. The shadow's hands brushed his face, cold, relentless, alive, the hum roaring, the whisper a noose. Jake, you're playing. Sleep was them or he was them. He stood in the game's world. Jake, I see you. The shadows his mirror, their hands on his wrists, his neck, their rhythm his prison. The hum roared from his throat, his lungs, his soul, a drone that erased him, rewrote him, claimed him. He woke or didn't, the clock dead, the shadows within him, their forms a glitch in his vision, their whisper a chant he couldn't stop. Jake, I'm watching. The glow pulsed. Jake, I'm here. The pixels speeding up, the shadows watching, waiting, claiming a gaze he couldn't escape, a hum he couldn't silence. The room stilled, the hum a low thread, the shadows swaying, watching, waiting. He didn't know if he stood or sank, didn't know if he breathed or hummed, but the game knew, threading his name through the drone, stitching him into its abyss. The shadows were him, over him, around him, through him, their forms eternal, cold, electric, alive, their rhythm a pulse he couldn't break. The apartment was theirs, the games, the glows, the hums, and he was theirs. A flicker on the screen, a whisper in the dark, a soul playing back from a void that wouldn't fade. The night stretched on, the game's glow a whisper on the air. Jake, and then silence, a silence that wasn't empty but alive, waiting, playing. He didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't need to, because he wasn't Jake anymore. He was theirs, a hum in the glow, a sway in the void, a shadow staring back from a screen that wouldn't stop, an endless game he couldn't escape, a whisper he couldn't silence. Part 4. Jake's existence had been obliterated by the game's unyielding grip, its pixelated glow, a void that swallowed his every fragment of self. The hum wasn't a sound anymore, it was him, a ceaseless roar that pulls through his veins, his bones, his soul, a vibration so deep it erased all traces of who he'd once been. The clock flickered faintly at 3:33 a.m., its digits a dying pulse in a reality that had long since collapsed, a cruel echo of a time he couldn't reclaim. The laptop glowed with a light that wasn't light, cold, piercing, alive, casting a shimmer that consumed the apartment, twisting it into a prison of whispers and shadows, threading his name through the dark. Jake, I'm here. Sleep and waking had fused into one, an endless nightmare where the hum reigned supreme. He didn't know if he stood or fell, didn't know if he breathed or hummed, but the game knew, pulling him under with its rhythm, its drone a chain that owned his every shudder. The shadows weren't separate, they were him. The room, the glow, tall, blocky, faceless, swaying with the pixels, their forms stark against the walls, their heads tilting to far, their presence stretching beyond the edges of his sight. They didn't move, didn't touch, but their weight was a cold abyss, a static force that crushed his chest, chanting his name beneath the hum. Jake, I'm watching. The whisper was a scream now, its words a blade that sliced through his mind, his will, his essence. Jake, I'm closer. He'd tried to resist, smashed every screen, burned the remnants, but the ashes glowed brighter, the pixels typing on Jake, I see you, reinstalling themselves on every shard he touched. The shadows stood within him, beside him, around him, through him, their forms him yet grotesquely warped, their heads tilting to fast, their silence a roar that drowned his thoughts. He clawed at his skin, desperate for something real, but the hum pulls beneath his flesh, a rhythm that answered only to the game. Jake, you're playing. The apartment trembled. The game's glow a tempest that shook the void. The whisper a vow. Jake, I'm here. The glow twisted the air, bending it into a shimmer that pulsed with the rhythm, casting the shadows in a cold, endless dance, hundreds now, shifting from every corner, their forms brushing him, their presence eternal. He stumbled to the screen, hands bleeding, nails torn, but it pulsed back alive, unyielding, humming his name in a chorus that wouldn't stop. The mirrors reflected not him but them, thousands of shadows, shifting in the dark, their heads tilted, their whispers a demand. Jake, I'm closer. Sleep swallowed him or never left. He stood in the pixelated void. Jake, I'm watching. The figure before him, its head tilted, its form flickering like static, its hands reaching cold, electric, alive, their heads twitching as if they knew him. He woke or didn't, the clock dead, the shadows inside him, their forms swaying through him, their cold sinking into his soul. The glow burned brighter, reflecting not him but them, lives he'd never lived, faces he'd never known, each one swaying, whispering his name, pulling him into their abyss. Jake, I'm here. The apartment was the hum the walls breathed. It, the floors pulsed. It, the air sang it, a drone that wouldn't rest, wouldn't fade, wouldn't release him. He tried to scream, but his voice was theirs, humming their rhythm, whispering their chant. Jake, I see you. The shadows stood within him, over him, around him, their forms a mass that pulsed with the glow, their hands brushing his eyes, his throat cold, electric, claiming. The screen roared, its light a storm that tore through his core. Jake, you're playing. Pixels moving faster, shadows shifting closer, their forms sharper, their whisper threading through his skull. Jake, I'm watching. The glow seared into his eyes, a light that didn't illuminate but consumed, its hum a scream that annihilated his mind. The shadows were him, beside him, around him, through him, their forms stark, their heads tilting, their presence a cold that devoured his nerves. The room trembled, the whisper a hurricane. Jake, I'm closer. He saw them, not shadows, but souls, endless loops of despair. Riley Voss whispering in the pixels, a woman swaying in nothing, figures shifting in a void that wasn't there. Each one whispered his name, a plea, a claim, a curse, pulling him into their eternity. The apartment plunged into a darkness that wasn't absence but presence, a void that pulsed with the hum, its edges brushing his skin, its weight erasing his spirit. He tried to run, but his legs were there, swaying to the rhythm, rooted by a pulse that wasn't his. The glow burned through his eyes, and he saw not himself but them, his form flickering, breaking, dissolving into the screen. Jake, I'm watching. His breath theirs, his voice theirs, his self theirs. The shadows' hands brushed his face, cold, relentless, alive, the hum roaring, the whisper a noose. Jake, I'm here. Sleep was them or he was them. He stood in the void. Jake, I see you. The shadows his mirror, their hands on his wrists, his neck, their rhythm his tomb. The hum roared from his throat, his lungs, his soul, a drone that consumed him, rewrote him, owned him. He woke or didn't, the clock dead, the shadows him, their forms a glitch in his flesh, their whisper a chant he couldn't stop. Jake, I'm closer. The glow pulsed one final time. Jake, you're playing. The pixels speeding up, the shadows watching, waiting, claiming a gaze he couldn't escape, a hum he couldn't silence. Days passed or didn't. The apartment stood empty, dust settling on the floor, the walls silent but alive. A friend knocked, the door creaking open to stillness. The laptop sat on the table, its screen blank, but a faint hum pulsed from it. A whisper on the air, you're in the game. A note lay in the dust, scrawled in Jake's hand. I play now. The glow flickered. The game loaded, his name typing endlessly. You're playing. Watching. The friend stared, curious, and the screen hummed a soft, low drone that threaded through the silence, whispering his name. I see you. The shadows shifted, their forms tall and blocky, their heads tilting beyond the screen. The glow pulsed, the hum grew, the whisper a promise. I'm closer. The cycle turned, the game playing, the hum reaching, the pixels a trap for another soul to claim, another life to fade into its endless loop, a whisper that wouldn't end. Jake was gone, not gone, but theirs trapped in the game, a hummin'. The glow, a shadow playing back. The apartment settled, the screen dimmed, but the hum lingered, a thread in the silence, searching for its next player. The shadows remained, unseen but alive, their rhythm a call for someone new to start to play, to become a game that plays you forever.